Welcome to the GreenPilled.network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it and is published every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more, visit our website at GreenPilled.network, where you can download the GreenPilled book for free, join the Discord, or become a member of your local GreenPilled.network chapter. My guest today is Jonas from the Optimism Foundation. He is the Retroactive Public Goods Funding Lead at the Optimism Foundation. If you're just joining us, Retroactive Public Goods Funding is a way of funding public goods, things that benefit the broader community, but traditionally have not had a strong business model. We're funding public goods retroactively. So retroactive public goods funding is a really powerful way of funding public goods because it's easier to see what has had impact in the past than to speculate on what might have impact in the future. And sort of the vision of Optimism Retroactive Public Goods Funding is to bootstrap a cycle in which people who build public goods are getting funded with millions of dollars of rewards using the OP token. So basically, Optimism has become an epicenter of funding public goods as of Retroactive Public Goods Funding rounds 1, 2, and now 3. And on this episode, we talk about Retroactive Public Goods Funding Round 3, which will have voting in November and early December, which will distribute 30 million OP and will have results live in early January. So I'm really excited about this because Optimism just feels very values aligned to me. They were one of the earlier funders on Gitcoin and have funded Gitcoin in the past. Gitcoin has funded them, I'm pretty sure. So we're building the regen public goods funding movement together. And this episode, we're going to talk about Retroactive Public Goods Funding Round 3. What are the nuts and bolts of how the mechanisms are designed? But then Jonas and I, during the episode, sort of parachute into the broader theory, vision, and movement that is being built around public goods funding in Web3. So a really fun episode for me. I am a huge believer in what Optimism is doing, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode with Jonas.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Hey, Jonas, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. I'm really excited about RPGF Round 3. What is it? When is it? What are y'all doing?
Oh, it's happening. It's happening. When we're recording this, we're just closing off the applications process. So anybody was able to apply for RetroPGF Round 3. And we had a super broad scope of what you could apply for. And then in November and early December, we're doing the voting for this. So this is going to be super exciting. We have around 150 badge holders participating in this, which is this super cool group of Optimism citizens. And then in January, we're going to announce the results and start to get the tokens out there.
So RPGF obviously stands for Retroactive Public Goods Funding. And the whole idea here is to reward people in the Optimism ecosystem and the broader Ethereum ecosystem that are contributing to public goods with retroactive airdrops of Optimism tokens. And as I understand it, retroactive public goods funding is easier to do because it's easier to see who has provided value as opposed to speculative who will have value in the future. So retroactive public goods funding could bootstrap a lot of amazing things from there. Did I get that right?
Yes, you got it. You got it exactly right. I think one of the beautiful things about this mechanism is you're doing one simple thing and you're trying to do it extremely well, which is reward past impact. We do this because we think like one of the reasonings here is it's simpler to reward things based on how useful they've been in the past. That's easier to do versus then rewarding things based on how useful they might be in the future. And the nice thing is you do this one really simple thing and it has all these like great big implications if you do it over and over again. So if you reward past impact reliably, this becomes like this thing people can rely on for their funding, and you start to create these almost market-like dynamics about building public goods and providing impact.
I remember reading in a blog post from Vitalik a little while ago about, I think it was a review of Optimism RetroPGF Round 1. And I believe that the vision that was put out there was that if you're regularly rewarding with tens of millions of dollars people who are contributing to public goods, then eventually what you do, if you're doing that consistently over time, and it gets big enough, is that you're creating an opportunity for private investors to invest in public goods, because then they can have a rational expectation of an exit in the future. So basically going from funding the next ICO or alt layer 1, because that's where the market can return funding now, to investing in public goods, things like Ethereum infrastructure, because you can expect that in RetroPGF Round 13, when there's tens of millions of dollars, that you could make an argument that there's going to be an exit from that. And so it actually is, retroactive public goods funding is sort of like one thing that's happening, but the broader vision is to bootstrap the ability for private capital, which is right now pointed at things that it can only capture value, to be able to point it at things that can create value for public goods. And I think that vision is just a really exciting thing to me.
Yes, Ben from the Optimism team had this fun talk, which was like freeing VCs from only investing in value extraction. That was like one of the things that got me pulled into this. Like this really fun idea of like, you as a VC are currently held back to only invest in things that are like value extraction machines. And now through RetroPGF, we give you this opportunity to invest in like positive sum things. I think overall, it's super, super exciting in this mechanism that you're trying to kind of create a market and put a price on positive externalities. And through this, you start to create this dynamic where it becomes really predictable, and you get like market type behaviors that are similar to like classical markets. And like upfront investment, VC funding into these things is one of these aspects. But really just changing the playing field. So providing something useful to Ethereum and Optimism becomes this like playing field that feels like you're competing and you're playing in this arena similar to how you would build any other project in this space. And this is really something where I think currently we're being held back a bit, because that is not the case. And so it's like much more profitable to spin up the next alt L1, or much more profitable to kind of jump into the DeFi space and like create this yield farm, rather than building a public good that supports the users of this network.
Yes, I see sort of the broader vision here. And each retroactive public goods funding round is sort of a notch in creating the credibility of that expectation of return. So I wonder if you could paint us a picture of round 1, round 2, how those went at a very high level, and how that informed round 3, which is just about to launch in a month or so here.
I say it's simple, right? Like agree on how useful things have been in the past.
Yeah.
Then
simple.
After working on this thing for a while, I was like, it's actually not that simple. So really how these rounds progressed is we're making big changes and improvements round over round. I think the first 2 rounds have been like super simple, super MVP prototype-like in the way we've ran them. So we had, in the first round, we had around like 20 people doing quadratic voting on like project information collected via a Google form. The second round was like a bit more sophisticated in how we've done it. We did a nomination process. We had projects create profiles, tell us the impact that they had in this space. We had a slightly better voting tool. And so the big difference there was like round 2 was like 10 million OP tokens. It took place beginning of the year. Round 1 was, I think, towards the end of 2021. And really the key is like round 3 is like a whole different scale of how we're running this project. And I hope like these big improvements keep on coming. And what also changed a lot is the cadence, right? So before that, we had like round 1, which took place in end of 2021. round 2, which took place in early 2023. So it was like this long time span, and it didn't create this predictable kind of reoccurring loop of retro funding. And now we're hoping to run these rounds at least every 6 months.
Yeah, so that consistent cadence, I think, is important because you collapse the reward what's creating public goods from like a theory and a hypothetical into actually, oh, we have results. And you can sort of start to infer the mechanism that we use created this results, and we want to tweak it round over round internally, but also the market gains confidence in, oh, this is the way that's going. So we could allocate capital to X, Y, and Z public goods because it's already happening.
Definitely. In the end, we want this to be highly predictable. So we want people to know beforehand what will be rewarded. The rough kind of mental model to think of this is like, think of like an impact calculator where you know, like if you support these many projects with your tool, or you create a library that these many projects use, these are roughly the metrics that will be used to evaluate this impact. And this is kind of the reward you can expect. I sometimes compare this to like if you're an artist and you're putting up music on Spotify, you can put into a calculator, like based on the number of streams, this is what Spotify will pay you. Not saying like Spotify is a great system. We should all pay our artists more. But this is kind of the predictability that Spotify has created around the system. And I think this is where we want to get to as well. So we want people to know what will be rewarded in the future so they can build things in expectation of these rewards and really start to kind of lean on the system more.
One of the things I think is really important here is the understandability of the system. I would call it legibility of the system. And it's late 2023 right now. 2023, I think, has in a lot of ways been the year of AI. And one of the things that I think is really sort of highlighted about crypto in the year of AI is how legible it is with crypto. You can see the mechanism. It can be provably, credibly neutral if you look at the mechanism. Whereas AI, it just does a bunch of stuff and you don't know how it got there. And it's not legible at all because there's a bunch of neural networks that you have no idea what they do. And we actually, for the governance of collective resources, need to have legibility to humans about how these systems work. Being able to infer which types of public goods are valuable is good because you can keep a mental model in your mind of where to invest in public goods, as opposed to just like some benevolent but completely opaque AI that would be delivering verdicts on what public goods are valuable and could change on a whim in a very mercurial way. So that legibility feels like a really important thing for any mechanism, but especially something as important as retroactive public goods funding.
I would say what's interesting here is with AI or LLMs, you definitely understand what it does for you, right? At least as like a simple end user of these products, while you don't really understand how the sausage is made. In different public goods funding mechanisms, and I think we're part of this, we're trying to tell people a lot about like how it's made and how it works. And people rarely understand what it does for them. And I think this is the switch that we're trying to get to, try to make it really clear, like if you create this impact, this is the rewards you can expect. And this is actually what I want people to get, rather than what we're currently doing, which I think we want to change a bit, which is like explaining people like, this is RetroPGF and these are the voters and this is the voting model, and trying to tell them all these intricacies of the system. And then people look at me and they're like, what am I supposed to do now kind of vibe?
Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you almost have to have like the version that's very solid for the people who are actually paying attention and will read the docs, and you the version that's memeable on Twitter. And they both have to be legible in their own way.
We need more and better RetroPGF memes, definitely.
Definitely. Well, it feels like to me the most important constituency is the badge holders. So those are the people who are actually deciding, hey, we've got X pot and we want to allocate Y tokens according to the voting. And I'm actually a badge holder. I was a badge holder last round, and I know the badge holder set is growing. So it feels like, maybe you could tell us about the criteria that you had for the badge holders, how they're selected, because it seems like that's where a lot of the decision making is happening.
Yes, I find this one of the super fascinating aspects of what we're doing here, which is typically in a lot of DAOs, especially kind of bigger, well-established DAOs, you have a plutocratic or a plutocratic only voting system where it's about one token, one vote. And what we're doing at Optimism is we're establishing this bicameral governance system where one of the two houses, the citizens' house, is a non-plutocratic system, which is a one citizen, one vote. And the idea really is Optimism is not only governed by OP token holders, which make up the token house, but it's also governed by the core users of Optimism and the members of the Optimism collective. And so this is the citizens' house and the people voting on RetroPGF. Personally, I find this like a super cool, almost goes back to, right, like, can you find alternative ways these systems are governed that are not only plutocratic, but that can also like represent user interests. And the vision for this long term is it's really essentially reputation and criteria based. We want to get to something where if you're a core user of Optimism and you've used this platform over and over again and you've built reputation here and you've maybe contributed to Optimism, you maybe received some RetroPGF, you may participated in governance, you automatically become a citizen. Like nobody needs to elect you or nobody needs to like invite you in, but this is like automatically based on the reputation that you've built. This is where we want to get to. And then where we currently are is we're only bootstrapping this reputation graph at the moment. And how we've done the expansion of this set of badge holders, of this set of citizens, is mostly an invite-based way. So how we did this in round 3 is every existing badge holder could invite a new badge holder, and projects that received RetroPGF in round 2, the top 50 projects, could also invite a new badge holder, and a few other minor tweaks. But it's been mostly invite-based, and I think the really interesting thing is we're now at around like 150 badge holders, and I hope the next round we can at least start to go into something that feels more like reputation criteria based.
So it feels like there's kind of a spectrum from in these projects. If we're progressively decentralizing, at first the capital allocation decisions are made by the founders, and then in some places it would be the founders, then their lieutenants, they'd push decision making down. But in DAOs, what we're doing is, and this may be too reductionist, tell me if I'm wrong, but creating this sort of badge holder system where progressively more and more badges can be given out based off of reputation. And we're going to go from founders to founders and the people around them to eventually everyone in the citizen house or the token house at Optimism from there. So distributing the power over time, but doing it incrementally as we're testing the results. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair. One of the challenges is, right, like try to build a really collusion resistant voting model, right? What's really interesting if you get into this is, at least in some aspects, you can model behavior in like a plutocratic system pretty easily, because it's like, if you make like very, very simple assumptions, it's like this person wants to increase the value of their token, and that's kind of their behavior model and why they're acting in this way. If you do something like a citizen's house where you give users a participation right, it's not as straightforward to model anymore. And so I think while we grow this, a really interesting challenge will be to figure out what are like the incentive models there, and how can we ensure that people that are badge holders and citizens have like this strong alignment with the interest of the collective. There's definitely like a lot of things to figure out there. I think running these experiments and like always pushing towards where it hurts gets you to figure them out fast.
Right. I love that philosophy. I'm always telling people we should look for the pain, not avoid the pain in my work, which is counterintuitive in some ways. I'm wondering if you could give me an example of collusion or the type of behavior that you would like to prevent. So is that like basically like me as a badge holder, Kevin Owaki, if I went in and I voted for Gitcoin, because I think Gitcoin's the ultimate public good, it could be construed that I'm doing it because I'm the founder of Gitcoin and I benefit reputationally or in some way from voting for Gitcoin. Is that like the kind of collusion that you're trying to prevent with badge holders in order, because you want them to steer for what's best for the collective, not what's best for them? There's like a principal agent problem in there somewhere.
Yes, it would be even worse if you then got together with other badge holders and you all elaborate on doing this. At scale, this problem is probably not as bad because it's because then you have like really large sample size of people behaving in this way. Yes, this is exactly one of the things we want to prevent. I think this is also a difference in doing RetroPGF versus doing something like quadratic funding, right? I think this is really nice about quadratic funding, which is you kind of implicitly measure the utility of different things by people participating in this system. While in RetroPGF, you try to do this kind of more abstract voting system. And at the moment where it's kind of you're really evaluating how much somebody has contributed for the collective. You're not telling us what projects you like and what projects you used, but your role as a voter in the system is really to tell us what you think this project's impact has been for the whole collective. And that's just a very different model of voting, which is counterintuitive, and it also requires like different incentives and assumptions about how people behave.
Yeah, totally. In my recent episode that I did with Vitalik, he talked about impact evaluation and impact measurement being one of the things that he's most interested in seeing. And I'm going to be paraphrasing, and I can never capture Vitalik's genius exactly, but basically like having an open standard in which we're measuring and evaluating impact and putting that information on chain so that people in future retroactive public goods funding experiments will have good data to say, oh, Project X has created Y impact and Project Z has created ABC impact according to D and E. You know, you can look at the audit trail of where that impact attestation came from. And so it feels like there's a whole category of interesting tools that could be invested in around helping badge holders make more informed decisions about what has had an impact on the collective. So basically going from like a gut check of like, oh, here's the vibe check that I get, or from my limited vantage point, what I see, to actually providing a little bit more quantitative data. Is there anything that you're excited about in that category of things?
Yes. Impact evaluation is really this kind of data collection and then like analytics problem that you're running into. And it took me some time to realize it's just like data is just it. Like you want to collect the right data and then you want to essentially run analytics to evaluate the impact. This is where we try to push the system a lot towards becoming better and better and more reliable at measuring impact. So to give you an example, round 1 and 2 have been more gut feel type voting on projects. This also worked because we have this highly informed group of citizens, and it was like this small set of projects. It was like round 1 was like 70 projects, round 2 was like about 200 projects. And now what we're doing is we're trying to push the system much more towards like quantitative and qualitative metrics. So if you sign up for RetroPGF, we actually ask you, provide us some metrics of your impact. Like how many users do you have? How many people have visited your conference? And this self-reporting is really the first naive step in getting to something that really feels like evidence-driven, well-measured impact proofs, if you will. And I think there are different exciting projects in this ecosystem at the moment, like hacking on this stuff, like Open Source Observer. And I hope what we get to is we can run rounds where we really pre-commit to the impact metrics that will be used. And like the dream would be to have a distribution formula. So like if you generate this impact, this is kind of the reward you can expect. And make this like super useful and reliable for our participants. But we're really at the start of like opening this box up of convincing everybody to like start tracking and measuring their impact and getting these primitives out there.
So it sounds like self-reporting is sort of the way of decentralizing the problem to start and starting to have more metrics. But then there's also projects like OS Observer that are creating infrastructure for this. There's obviously HyperCert's Ethereum attestation service that could start to decentralize attestations and impact measurement. And over time, hopefully we'll see RPGF get more quantitative and measurable and have, I love the word impact proofs there. It kind of breaks my brain to think about how one might construct that, but maybe that's part of the challenge and the part of where the ecosystem is trying to figure out how to generate these impact proofs.
Yes, I think what's cool about what we're currently doing is by doing self-reporting, we get to understand how projects think about their impact themselves. This is one of the aspects where I think we don't want to design a very top-down system that is like abstract, like putting up like these abstract metrics and then saying to projects like, here is essentially the goal you should optimize for. By doing self-reporting first, now we have this huge collection of metrics that people have given to us, and also pain points around how they collect these metrics. And so the next step is kind of optimizing for methods to more reliably track and measure them. To give you an example that I found interesting is we have all these events telling us how many people attended the event. And at the moment, what they're doing is they're just like putting down a number, and then it's like, trust us that these many people actually were here. If we did something, if they had something like co-ops, right, or similar, they could do this really nice traceable thing where people self-attest to visiting the event, and they can attest that this person was there. And this would have the effect of all of a sudden creating this proof of impact for the system, but also building this Sybil-resistant reputation graph where somebody can read like co-op is essentially this graph where people can prove that they've been to all these events. And I think these are interesting aspects you get around to, which is like initially you think of POAP as that super cute small like NFT you got for visiting an event, and then in the end you understand it's kind of like a proof of impact, and at the same time it's like this thing that's useful for your reputation graph.
The meme I really like here is moving from virtue signaling, which I think Web 2 is famous for, to proof of virtue. And what would it look like if we moved from a world where people give to impact projects so they feel good about themselves, and so they can virtue signal to their friends that they did it, to giving to the most impactful projects, and you actually have decentralized cryptographic proofs of what has created the most impact. And so it's sort of exciting to think about this stepwise change, and the fact that there's off-the-shelf components that we can take to compose it, I think, is one of the superpowers of Web3.
I think we're all kind of, at the moment, getting to gather around this space. It kind of is becoming the selling point if you look at a lot of projects. So HyperCerts, for instance, really went deep on formulating this idea of like, what if we had something like carbon credits for impact, and that as like a generalized framework. I think the Protocol Labs folks have been thinking about this a lot. I know people at Gitcoin have been as well, and you're kind of in the middle of this whole thing. And I think just happy at Optimism that we're able to push this space forward and really build on this idea that at the core of what we're trying to realize as a project is rewarding impact and creating this whole new kind of economic layer that goes beyond just rewards for validators, but we have rewards for people contributing to the network and the ecosystem. And it feels like we're all kind of starting to go in like a similar direction here of the problems we're looking to solve.
Plus one to that, I actually just tweeted yesterday this little graph of all of the different Web3 funding impact funding allocators, of which I would count Optimism and DAO Drops and ClearFund and Gitcoin and Giveth and Protocol Guild and a bunch of different tools in. And basically like the visualization, it has Optimism in the center because Optimism actually is giving out the most funding. I think Optimism and Protocol Guild are giving out tens of millions of dollars. And then you've got Giveth and Gitcoin and ClearFund giving out millions of dollars, and then smaller experiments from there. But what I think is really interesting is like Optimism giving out funding to Gitcoin and ClearFund and Giveth and Protocol Guild. And then from there, each of those projects have their own mechanisms in which they're funding more impact from there. And so it's almost like this positive sum game in which it's creating hearts and minds, like a groundswell of like hearts and minds coming into it and people working on it. But the net export, the GDP of this like multicellular impact organism that we're building here is the money that's going out and funding actual impact projects. And those could be, carbon projects, those could be Ethereum validator clients, consensus clients, things of that nature. That could be anything that's creating impact. And so I'm really interested in seeing this like multicellular organism, which I'm calling Optimism a cell, Gitcoin a cell, Giveth, DAO drops, all our cells. Like, what does this look like when it's not just 5 or 10 impact allocators, but 1,000 in the future? Like every DAO is part of this mesh network, this multicellular organism we're creating that has like pro-social outcomes from it. And so A, it's really cool that exists now, because 5 years ago when I was starting Gitcoin, there's no one that was working on this stuff. But B, it's also like, how can we create the groundswell, make that Schelling point stronger? And then there's this feedback loop between more hearts and minds working on it, better impact, and then more people join the movement from there. So yes, +1 to it being a positive sum game between all these different projects. And I think Optimism is one of the biggest funders of that. So thank you for your role in that. I don't know if you have any takes on the multicellular organism or sort of the regen ecosystem that's evolving here.
Yeah, the way I think about this is essentially back to this, like you want to do bottom up curation, and I think this applies as well into like you want to do bottom up funding. So you don't want to construct one system which kind of tries to do this job of evaluating impact for everybody. What you want to do is like you want to allow communities to essentially do this job for themselves. And so one of the things I'm currently seeing in the RetroPGF applications is we have some communities where a lot of individual members apply to RetroPGF versus applying as one community. And if you're like part of one contributor group, it's much easier for you as a group to understand who did what and how to reward these contributions, rather than like one batch holder or multiple batch holders trying to understand the same thing. And I feel like in this aspect, it makes a whole lot of sense if we're getting to an ecosystem where you're getting funding to trickle down to be as close to kind of essentially be governed as close to the ground as possible. And this is one of the interesting aspects. If we think a good example of this is maybe a BIDO Guild. So RetroPGF funded BIDO Guild, and BIDO Guild then distributed at least parts, I don't have like the full context, but at least part of these rewards to members of the BIDO Guild. And they have, for instance, like a UBI program. This makes much more sense than like every BIDO Guild member that is receiving this UBI to apply to RetroPGF. This is how we can build this really, like, why building a highly composable ecosystem where all these different parts essentially work together and like the funding flows down makes a lot of sense in my mind. So you can use the aspects of the different mechanisms where they are the most strongest. And I think this is like quadratic funding in different aspects, this maybe retro funding in different aspects, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. I had Divya Siddharth on the podcast around episode 50, and she talks a lot about this principle of subsidiarity, which is that, you know, you've got people in their local communities that understand more in their in their community, in their subsidiary, bottoms up what's valuable. And, you know, through the principle of subsidiarity or modularity, we can really scale a lot of these things. But my mind also returns to, you know, in the episode with Vitalik, we talked about how a lot of these things are basically, they have funding sources and they have funding distribution allocation mechanisms. And I think one of the challenges here is that your allocation mechanism has to be really local and bottoms up, but sometimes it's really hard to scale your funding input mechanism when you have that sort of grassroots organic bottoms up decision making. And so the ability to decouple those things, have open source software so that we can cross-pollinate these genes across the cells, and then bootstrap the funding with something like Optimism, which has a very scalable funding source, creates a really interesting opportunity to have local decision-making, but global sources of funds. And there's like an economy of scale there that I think is pretty revolutionary. It's only possible in Web3, where we have this open source software so that we can trade decision-making with each other, but also like really sustainable recurring sources of funding. So +$1, everything you're saying, I'm just trying to paint another picture of what it looks like from where I'm sitting.
Totally. I think at the moment we're in this ecosystem where people that create funding mechanisms seem slightly disconnected from funders in this ecosystem.
Yeah.
And they're mostly like different groups. And we have this problem, which is we don't have enough funders. We're with Optimism. I think we're the single biggest ones, and there should be many more actors in this ecosystem, including L2s, participating in this way. I think if we can get people building mechanisms and funders closer together, we create this really great feedback, like product iteration feedback loop of understanding what is helpful and what works and what doesn't. To close the loop of where this funding is coming from, you alluded to this. Optimism as a project is really core to it is this public goods funding aspect. And this is at the core of who we are. To like do the kind of quick version of the background story that I wasn't here for, but other people were, is it started out as this research collective called Plasma Group, which couldn't receive funding for the great work they were doing. And so Plasma Group transitioned to Optimism, and so Plasma Group wasn't able to capture enough funding, even though they were doing the super valuable research on how to scale Ethereum. As Plasma Group transitioned to Optimism, core of the mission and vision behind this project is to fund the public goods that we all rely on. And the core way we do this, and the feedback cycle we have at the heart of what Optimism is through protocol revenue. So part of every time you send a transaction fee on OP mainnet, every time you set a transaction fee on Base, every time you set a transaction fee on Public Goods Network, anytime you set a transaction fee on Zora, and there will be more OP chains to come, part of this transaction fee revenue is dedicated towards RetroPGF. So part of this will be used for RetroPGF Round, which hopefully will increase the contributions and the impact generated in this ecosystem, which should make everything more useful and should drive more demand for block space. So we see more participation and more transactions. So we have more revenue to distribute via RetroPGF. And this is really this great loop. And I want to be slightly spicy here. And like the mental model you should think about this is think about ultrasound money. Ultrasound money is this way where we burn ETH, it kind of benefits ETH holders. And we get into this really nice cycle. The more transactions we have, the more ETH we burn, the more ETH should go up in price. That's kind of the core economic feedback loop we're thinking about there. I think what we're doing at Optimism is kind of the regen version of this, which is the more transactions there are on the network, the more funding there is for public goods, the more value this ecosystem generates, the more transactions we should see in this ecosystem. And so I think we need to meme this better, but we should come up with what is the alternative to the ultrasound money meme, the regen,
ultra regenerative money. Yeah, so that key thing, the key point there feels like the loop where basically the more transactions generated on OP stack chains, on the super chain, the more the Optimism treasury grows, the more can be funded public goods, and those public goods funding creates more transactions. And so what you're doing here is you're not treating public goods as this hippy dippy thing that you do because you're donating a certain amount to build your brand or to be seen as altruistic for recruiting. You know, the whole Google thing where you support enough open source that you can virtue signal to software developers that you fund open source. This is actually like a fundamental core part of Optimism, where you see funding public goods as kind of like a meta for growing your L2, spinning this flywheel, captures hearts and minds, creates more transaction volume, creates more value in Optimism. And that's like a pretty core difference from how a lot of teams in the space view funding public goods. And so it's that closed loop where impact equals profit, and you're able to create a flywheel around it that feels like the genuine innovation here.
We win because we fund public goods. I think this is part of the big picture here. And I think we want to demonstrate this to others. So this becomes like a dominant strategy. And this is not only in the way the overall Optimism collective behaves, but also in the behavior of different participants within RetroPGF. We move away from this thing where it feels like you're asking people or predominantly it feels like you're relying on donations to do this open source project. And it's kind of like people have this goodwill of donating to you to sustain it. We're trying to shift this to something where it feels like obvious and rational that these projects receive funding. And for the people that are running and maintaining these projects, that it becomes rational to do this because it's actually like a highly profitable, fun, engaging thing. And this is something where I think the mental model should be more like, if we think of like the nation state type comparison, you're not surprised that you're paying taxes and these taxes go to like good causes that provide value to you, right? This is not currently how we're thinking of this. We're thinking, right, like in this community, we're often thinking of this as like a nice, good-hearted thing to do. And we should think of this much more as like the rational, obvious
the meta
that you want to do.
Yeah, totally. You know, in Vitalik's interview with David Hoffman during Permissionless Chew this year, he said Dao governance and funding public goods are the same problem. And it kind of like blew my mind for a sec, because I was like, you know, in the community, you want to allocate funding to what matters in your community. That's the same problem. Funding public goods in your community is the same problem as DAO governance, just at a different scale. In a large corporation, you'd have this bureaucratic departments and hierarchies where you would fund everything the department needs. But since we're not building these giant hierarchical centralized corporations, we're creating these decentralized ecosystems with many different cells in them. We have to have funding public goods mechanisms that are scalable, incredibly neutral, and it's just the meta in DAO governance and ecosystem governance is going to be funding your public goods in some way. And what really excites me about this is like, if Optimism can bootstrap this meta in the Web3 ecosystem, we get all the L2s, you know, running our PGF rounds, doing Gitcoin grants, doing whatever else. Then eventually we hit escape velocity where the mechanisms that we bootstrapped for funding public goods in Web3 can start to go towards like real world public goods, things like open source software, climate change, you know, solving for surveillance software. But like, we're going to bootstrap it and hit it at escape velocity within Web3 because it's our meta to do it within Web3. But then it could eventually be what governments will use their tax dollars to fund public goods for one day. I don't know, 10 years out. That's at least what's in my vision. So yeah, how does that land with you?
Tim, we interviewed Tim Bako for RetroPGF as like a small little fun promotional video where he talked about Protocol Guild. And he had a good quote in there, which was, Ethereum is the economic test net for the world. And here we're just like experimenting with things before we ship it to essentially ship it and extend it in the real world. Not the exact quote, but kind of butchering it. And I feel like this is what we're doing here as well. I think the ambition is Optimism, and what we're doing with Ethereum becomes the backend infrastructure for the web. And so with this, we can also build the public goods funding infrastructure for the web. And from there, right, like you can think further of like how far you can pull this thing if you can demonstrate that it's actually a very efficient capital allocation mechanism, which creates the goods and services that people want. Right? If we're able to demonstrate this and we're able to really do something unique that is kind of better than existing methods, such as, right, like you elect a board and this board elects a CEO and the CEO, right? And like, this is how you do things through like top-down delegation. If we can demonstrate that we're able to build better, more efficient mechanisms that fund the things that we want and like drive the behavior we want to see, we can take it to like scales unimaginable. I think that's the really large vision. I think to do this, we need to find our first grounding, and I think this is where we really currently are. And I think what I wish to see is like many more experiments to really get going. There should be funding rounds like Gitcoin rounds or like RetroPGF rounds constantly going on and en masse. And we really want to experiment and test on this stuff and get from like a landscape of like very theoretical thinking to like very applied programs.
Yeah, moving from theory to practice and then back again as we iterate.
Yes.
I just want to share real quick an anecdote. I think I've shared it on the GreenPilled before, and anytime Gitcoin and Optimism cross, I share it. But in the bear market, I had been sharing with a few people close to me that I was worried that Gitcoin was not going to make it. The last bear market, the 2018, 2019 one, and Vitalik pulls me onto this call, which is kind of scary because he's like my idol and like a hero and everything like that, as much as he doesn't want to be. And I was like, I have no idea what the context of this call was, and I was worried that. I was just worried about it. And then I pop on and it's Vitalik and Jing and Ben and Carl on the call. And I'm like, what is going on? And they're like, Kevin, we want Gitcoin to have the last 100K from Plasma Group so that you can like get through the bear market. And I was like, oh, you guys, like, bless your hearts. And it did help us get through the last bear market. Gitcoin, it was a very stressful time. And what they said to me was, you're bootstrapping this culture of public goods in the ecosystem, and we just think what you're doing is important, and we want you to have this money because we want you to make it. And for me, it's sort of like, people can talk about like working together and cooperating a lot, but like, when you put some money behind it, it just has like a little bit more of like a heft to it. And from there, it sort of like really planted the seed for me in this idea of like practical pluralism of basically. We're going to have many different regen protocols and apps that are all building a movement together, and it's about the movement and cooperating together in order to bootstrap the vision of the world that we want to see. And I always tell the story to people at Gitcoin so that they know that Optimism are our partners in building the ecosystem. But it really extends out, I think, to all of the different applications for me now: ClearFund, Giveth, Octane, Protocol Guild, all of them with this ethos of we're building this movement together, and we should support each other. And not play the zero-sum games of the past. And I think there's also, like a little bit of analogy for me of like client diversity at the Ethereum layer, where we've got Prism and Lighthouse and all these other applications that don't vie for like 100% market share, but it's in the diversity of the clients that we create anti-fragility in the network. And I think the same is true of public goods funding, to have this like pluralistic network of different things that fund public goods. But I don't know. I just wanted to share that anecdote with the audience so that they know how much I consider Optimism and Gitcoin to be friends with each other, and that we're all working together to build this movement. So I hope to invite you back in a couple of years, and we'll talk about how far we've come at that point, because we've come a long way in here 2023 from 2019 when the Plasma Group folks made that gesture towards us. So yeah, thank you to Optimism for leading the charge.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't there like an even bigger full circle aspects there where like Plasma Group initially got some funding through Gitcoin?
I wish I had the data in front of me so I could say for sure, but it would not surprise me if that happened. But yes, but this is like, I know this sounds like it felt more profound in 2019 because there's the whole meme of like Ethereum is a dark forest and it's a very PvP environment and it's very zero sum. And just like bootstrapping a couple positive sum like flywheels back then was like an incredibly radical act. And it still sort of is, because Ethereum by and large is very PvP, but we can grow this positive sum ecosystem together. So I'm just here for it.
Same, 100%. One thing I'm excited about is, as we get a lot of more, and I feel like that's happening at the moment, we get a lot of more like applied public goods funding online, is we also get to sharing all our learnings, so we don't do the same mistakes twice. To give you an example, we talk to different, or I'm often talking to different teams at Gitcoin just to learn what Gitcoin has learned. For instance, in like reviewing applications or these specific aspects of running these rounds. And I feel this is what we're trying to pioneer more and more at Optimism and how we run these rounds. So if you're interested in like what we've done and what we've learned, you can check out, like we like write extensive blog posts and documentation on like all the pain points and everything that went wrong in these rounds and what we learned. I think one of the things that we're currently not great in Ethereum land at is embracing failures. So this is one of my personal pet peeves when I go to conferences, which is I feel like I go somewhere and every time it's like new ideas and new great like thought leadership on like the large vision of what people are building. And I rarely ever get to go to a talk and it's like, this is what we shipped and it didn't work and this is what we learned. And I think part of like what you're describing as to playing these positive sum games is really embracing failure and make sure we learn from each other. And I hope we see, like, I hope like this, I think also the environment is changing. So I hope like when I go to the next conferences, this is starting to become more and more of, here's what we actually learned, like how we solved this.
Yeah, I think the learning is an important part of the iteration and experiment life cycle. Well, I'd love to keep riffing with you, but we're down to 3 minutes left before the end of the hour. So I guess we should start wrapping up. Maybe we'll end on a tangible note. Can you just rattle off the dates and, for RetroPGF Round 3, like the TLDR of Round 3, so that we can end on the tangible?
100%. We're doing the voting November to December. We're going to announce the results in January. I think the call out really is, this is round 3, and we're going to run a whole lot of more rounds until we can't anymore. So if you're interested in building something for RetroPGF, you can jump in. If you're building an open source software project in this area, in the arena, check it out and see if you're probably eligible and you probably should apply to the next round. So this is kind of the next date is like mid 2024. We should see the next RetroPGF round.
Right, round 4. Yeah. And so there will be some links in the show notes in which people can check out the information about RetroPGF Round 3 and get involved, apply for the rounds, and keep an eye on how things are going. Jonas, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for having me. Wonderful to be on the pod. I've been following along for a long time, and great to see a lot of GreenPilled initiatives. I think see you at DevConnect, and I think there are like a load of public goods events where we will all hang out and have a blast.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, back to you. Thank you to Optimism and you for running the RPGF Round 3. Really excited about building this movement together. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right, we just heard from Jonas from the Optimism Foundation. I am very excited about retroactive public goods funding. It's one of the most legitimate and largest experiments in funding public goods in Web3. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. Again, we are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world, like Optimism, like Jonas, like Retroactive Public Goods Funding. If you value our work, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It just really helps get into the ears of more listeners to build the Regen Web3 movement. So remember to subscribe, rate, and review, and share this podcast episode with a friend that you want to be part of the movement. Talk to you next time. Peace and love.